The day the world ended, it began with a flash of light, white and silent and absolute. It wasn't like a bomb. There was no sound, no heat. One moment, Jack Keller was staring at a half-corrected history paper on the Treaty of Versailles. The next he was on the floor of his study, the taste of copper in his mouth. The clock on his wall read 2:14 p.m. His watch read 2:14 p.m. The digital clock on his cable box read 2:14 p.m. They were all frozen. He scrambled to his feet, his head buzzing like a fallen power line. Outside, the world was unnervingly still. No birds sang, no cars passed on the quiet street of Harmony Creek, Maine. There was just the sun, hanging in the sky like a yellow thumbtack. He stumbled to his front door and pulled it open. The air felt thin, sharp. Across the street, his neighbor, old Mrs. Gable, was standing on her porch. She was a sweet woman, 90 if she was a day, who always brought him a slice of her apple pie on Thanksgiving. Now she was staring at him. Her face, usually a roadmap of gentle wrinkles, was a mask of pure, undiluted hatred. Her pale blue eyes were chips of ice. "Keller!" she hissed. Her voice was not the frail, reedy thing he was used to. It was rough, like stones grinding together. "Thief." Jack blinked. "Mrs. Gable, are you all right?" There was a flash of light. "My grandfather told me about your kind," she spat, one crooked finger pointing at him like a weapon. "Told me how your great-grandfather swindled him out of the North pasture, cheated him. A piece of paper and a liar's smile. That land was Gable land. It will be again." Jack felt a cold dread wash over him that had nothing to do with the frozen clocks. He knew the story she was talking about. It was a town legend, 100-year-old land dispute settled in court in 1922. It was a footnote in a local history book. It was not something a person felt. Not like this. The venom in her voice was fresh, as if the deal had been signed yesterday. He saw her husband, Mr. Gable, come to the door behind her. He held an old rusty pitchfork. His eyes held the same ancient, burning rage. They weren't seeing Jack Keller, the high school history teacher. They were seeing an enemy from a ghost story. He slammed the door shut and locked it. His heart was hammering. He backed away from the door, his eyes wide, looking around his silent house. The quiet was the worst part. The world had stopped, and in the silence, old ghosts were waking up. He peeked through the blinds. Down the street, two men were shouting at each other, the Carlucci brothers who ran the Italian bakery. They were screaming at Patrick O'Malley, the plumber. But they weren't screaming about a botched pipe job. They were screaming about the Sacco and Vanzetti trial, about anti-immigrant sentiment, words Jack had only ever read in textbooks. O'Malley screamed back, his face purple with fury, calling them slurs Jack hadn't heard outside of a 1920s documentary. This wasn't just a power outage. This wasn't a gas leak causing hallucinations. Something had been planted, a seed of the past, blooming into a monstrous, hateful flower in the present. He looked at his hands. They were shaking. The flash of white light hadn't been an attack. It had been a broadcast, a signal, and it had plugged every single person directly into the worst parts of their own history. Humanity's bloody, sordid, hateful past was no longer in the books. It was on the front lawn, holding a pitchfork. The silence broke an hour later. It wasn't the familiar sound of life returning, of cars starting and phones ringing. It was the sound of a window shattering down the street. It was followed by a roar of anger, deep and guttural, Jack stayed away from the windows. The fear was a physical thing now, a cold, heavy lump in his stomach. He was a history teacher. He lived in the past in a way. He spent his days explaining the causes and effects of human conflict. The Peloponnesian War, the Crusades, the endless, brutal cycles of us versus them. He had always been separated from it by the clean, safe barrier of time. Now that barrier was gone. He was living in one of his own lessons, the most terrifying lesson of all. His phone was dead. The landline was dead. The internet was a ghost. He was trapped in his house in a town that was rapidly eating itself alive. He needed to understand. He went to his bookshelf, his hands tracing the spines of the books that had been his life's work. World histories, biographies, deep dives into specific conflicts. He pulled one out, a thick volume on European conflicts of the 19th century. He opened it to a random page, a chapter on the Franco-Prussian War. The text was crisp and clear, but then he blinked, and for a second the words seemed to shimmer. He looked closer. The name of a French general, Patrice de MacMahon, flickered. For a split second, it was replaced by the name Mayor Thompson, his town's mayor. He shook his head, thinking his mind was playing tricks on him. He slammed the book shut and pulled out another, a book on American colonial history. He flipped to a section on the Salem witch trials. There was a famous woodcut illustration of a woman being accused by a mob. Her face was usually a crude, anonymous sketch. Now it had features, familiar features. It was Sarah Jenkins, the town librarian. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, her eyes wide with terror, and pointing at her was a man who looked disturbingly like the hardware store owner, Bill Miller. Jack dropped the book. It hit the floor with a loud thud that echoed in the silent house. It wasn't just memories. It wasn't just old grudges. Something was actively rewriting the script. It was taking the templates of history's horrors and slotting the people of Harmony Creek into the roles. The Gables were reenacting a century-old land feud. The Carluches and O'Malley were fighting a battle of immigration and prejudice from the 1920s. And now it seemed the town was preparing for a witch hunt, with Sarah Jenkins as the target. Who? Why? The question hammered at him. It had to be from the outside. The flash of light, the global nature of the event. He assumed it was global. It had to be. This was too precise, too coordinated. An intelligence far beyond human capability was at work. Aliens. The thought was absurd, the stuff of cheap movies. But what other explanation was there? They hadn't invaded with ships and lasers. They had invaded with something far more insidious. They had invaded with humanity's own resume. They had looked at the long, dark history of human violence, bigotry, and paranoia, and they had seen not a tragedy, but a tool, a weapon, a blueprint. They weren't destroying humanity. They were giving humanity the means to destroy itself, using a playbook it had written in its own blood. A siren began to wail outside. Not the clean modern sound of a police car. It was an old, rising and falling shriek, like an air raid siren from World War II. It was a sound designed to inspire panic. It was working. Jack could hear doors opening, people shouting. The performance was beginning. Jack spent the next few hours in a state of suspended terror. He locked himself in his study, the room furthest from the street. The air raid siren wailed for a solid 30 minutes before sputtering into silence, leaving an even more profound quiet in its wake. He sat on the floor surrounded by his books, which now felt like ticking bombs. He was afraid to open them, afraid of whose face he might see staring back at him from the gallows or the guillotine. He forced himself to think, to be the historian, analyze the data. The phenomena were specific. They were historical. They seemed tied to lineage and long-held, even subconscious, cultural identities. The Gables and their land. The Italians and the Irish. These were old wounds. So old they should have been nothing but faint scars. The alien influence, whatever it was acting like a universal irritant, making these old scars itch and burn until people had no choice but to scratch them raw. It was diabolically clever. There was no single enemy to fight. The enemy was your neighbor. The enemy was your friend. The enemy was your friend. The enemy was the simmering resentment you inherited from your great-great-grandfather. How do you fight a war when the battlefield is your own mind? He had to get to Sarah. The image of her face in that book about the Salem witch trials was seared into his brain. She was the town librarian, a kind, intelligent woman who believed in facts and reason. In the coming madness, a person like that would be a primary target. A witch, an intellectual, someone who asked questions. He had to warn her. The sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across his lawn. The sky turned a bruised purple. He knew he couldn't wait for morning. The darkness would only make things worse. Night has always been the friend of monsters. He crept to his back door, his old baseball bat clutched in his hand. It felt flimsy and useless. The world outside his door was a new country, and he didn't speak the language. He took a deep breath and slipped outside, sticking to the shadows. The air was cold and smelled of wood smoke. Someone had started a fire. He hoped it was for warmth. He feared it was for something else. The 10-minute walk to the library felt like a journey through enemy territory. He saw figures moving in the distance, small groups of people huddled together, talking in low, urgent tones. He saw one man, a mechanic named Dave, meticulously painting a white circle on his own front door. Jack's blood ran cold. He recognized the symbol. During the plagues of Europe, a painted mark on a door meant disease. It meant quarantine. It meant stay away or you will die. But who was Dave quarantining? Or who was he trying to keep out? He ducked behind a hedge as a pickup truck rumbled past. Bill Miller, the hardware store owner, was at the wheel. In the passenger seat was the town's deputy sheriff, a young man named Harris. But Harris wasn't wearing his uniform. He was wearing a simple brown shirt and a red armband. The armband was blank. But the implications screamed at Jack from across the centuries. It was the uniform of a true believer, a member of a newly formed militia. The truck bed was full of men holding garden tools, shovels, axes, tire irons. They looked like a posse, a lynch mob. He finally reached the library. It was dark, a large brick tomb in the center of town. He circled to the back, to the small employee entrance he knew Sarah used. He tapped on the metal door, his knuckles making a sound that seemed impossibly loud. "Sarah," he whispered. "Sarah, it's Jack. Let me in." For a long moment there was nothing. Then he heard the scraping sound of a bolt being drawn. The door cracked open an inch, and he saw Sarah's terrified eyes staring out at him. "Jack," she breathed, her voice trembling. "They came for the books." She pulled him inside and slammed the door, shooting the bolt home. The inside of the library was a disaster. Books were torn from the shelves, their pages ripped out, strewn across the floor like dead leaves. It was a scene of utter desecration. "Who did this?" Jack asked, his voice low. "Miller." "And his group?" she said, wringing her hands. "They came in here an hour ago. They weren't looking for specific books. They were looking for lists. Records, genealogy. Who came from where? Who owned what? They said they were purifying the town's history. Jack looked at the carnage. It wasn't just random vandalism. It was a targeted strike. An intellectual purge. They weren't just rewriting history, they were erasing it. They were destroying the evidence, so that only their new, hateful version could exist. "It's happening, Sarah," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "They're using our history to kill us. And you and I, people who deal in facts, we're at the top of their list." They huddled in the back office of the library, the only room that hadn't been completely ransacked. Sarah had made a small pot of coffee on a camping stove she kept for emergencies. The smell of it was a small, fragile piece of the old world. "Aliens," Sarah said, her voice flat. She wasn't questioning him, she was processing. "It's the only thing that fits, a simultaneous psychic event on a global scale." "They read us," Jack said, pacing the small room. "They scanned our entire history, the whole bloody mess. The conquests, the genocides, the inquisitions, the betrayals. They didn't see a tragedy. They saw a manual, a how-to guide for making a species self-destruct." He stopped and ran his hands through his hair. "Think about it. It's the perfect invasion. No ships to shoot down. No soldiers to fight. They just whisper in our ears. They remind the Gables of a land deal from 1922. They remind the descendants of the English and the Irish of Cromwell. They remind a man whose great-uncle died in the Pacific Theater to hate the Japanese-American family who runs the grocery store. They amplify it, turn up the volume from a faint historical echo into a deafening roar of rage." Sarah looked up at him, her face pale in the dim emergency light. "And the books. They're changing the books. They're changing the record itself." "Yes, to legitimize the madness," Jack agreed. "They show Bill Miller a picture of you as a witch in a history book. So when he comes for you, he's not a murderer. He's a righteous crusader. A witch finder. He has historical precedent. It's not just in his head, it's on the page. They're weaponizing our archives." A chilling thought occurred to him. What about the internet, the digital records, Wikipedia, all of it? Sarah shook her head. "Dead. Nothing, not just down. It feels like it's been wiped. Erased. All that information, our collective global brain gone. We've been thrown back into a new dark age. The only history that exists now is what's in our heads and what's in these paper books. And they are corrupting both." They were cut off from the world. They were information specialists, trapped on an island where information itself had become the disease. Everything they had dedicated their lives to, knowledge, reason, historical context, was now being used as an instrument of annihilation. "So what's the pattern?" Sarah asked, her librarian's mind trying to categorize the chaos. "What specific historical models are they using here, in Harmony Creek?" Jack began to tick them off on his fingers. 1. The land dispute, the oldest conflict there is, rooted in family legacy and territory. That's the Gables. 2. Ethnic and nativist strife. The fear of the other, the immigrant. That's the Calusis and O'Malley. 3. The purge of intellectuals and scapegoats. The witch hunt, the fear of those who think differently. That's us, Sarah. And it's being led by Miller. Miller, Sarah mused. He's the strong man. The charismatic leader who rises from chaos. Every dark chapter has one of those, a Robespierre, a McCarthy. Exactly, Jack said. He provides simple answers to complex fears. The problem isn't a mysterious alien signal. The problem is your neighbor. The problem is the librarian who keeps books full of lies. The problem is the family with the wrong last name. It's a classic model of societal collapse. He fell silent, the weight of it all pressing down on him. Humanity wasn't being conquered. It was being audited. The aliens were cosmic accountants who had reviewed humanity's ledger, a long and sordid document written in red ink, and had simply handed it back, stamped with the words, "Like it, yourselves." They didn't need to fire a single shot. They had given humanity a mirror, and humanity was screaming at its own reflection. Here is something else," Jack said slowly. "A new piece of the puzzle clicking into place. All these models they're using, the land feuds, the religious purges, the ethnic hatred, they all have something in common." "What?" Sarah asked. "They are all models of division," Jack said. "They are all based on splitting people apart, on creating an us and a them. That's the core of the blueprint. Division." The realization hung in the air between them, as cold and sharp as a shard of glass. Their enemy wasn't just using history. It was using a specific, fundamental principle of human failure. And to fight it, they would have to find a principle that was its opposite. The next morning, the town had changed. The false quiet of the previous day was gone, replaced by a low humming tension. Jack and Sarah watched from the library's dusty upper windows. The town square was no longer empty. Bill Miller was there, standing on the back of a flatbed truck, addressing a crowd of about 50 or 60 people. The men from his posse were there, their makeshift red armbands stark against their work clothes. They stood as a perimeter around the crowd, their faces set and grim. They were the new authority. Miller wasn't shouting. He was speaking in a calm, reasonable tone that was far more frightening than any rant. He was using the language of community, of safety, of purification. "Friends, neighbors," he said, his voice amplified by a battery-powered bullhorn. "Something happened to us yesterday. A sickness, a confusion. It was sent to weaken us. But we are not weak. We are the heart of this country. We are decent, hard-working people. But there are taints among us, historical taints, families who carry old grudges. People who harbor foreign ideas that have poisoned this nation for centuries. We have to be clean. We have to be pure. We have to be a true harmony in Harmony Creek." Jack felt sick. He had read speeches like this 100 times. In German, in Russian, in English. The words were always the same. Purity, sickness, the enemy within. It was the rhetoric of the pogrom, the prelude to the purge. "He's giving them a story they can understand," Jack whispered to Sarah. "A story where they are the heroes, and anyone who isn't them is the villain." "Look," Sarah said, pointing. A man was being shoved toward the truck. It was Mr. Tanaka, the elderly man who owned the grocery store. His family had been in the United States since the 1890s. He was as American as Bill Miller, but his face was Japanese. Two of Miller's men held Mr. Tanaka by the arms. His glasses were gone, and there was a cut on his forehead. Miller stopped talking and looked down at him with a look of theatrical pity. "George Tanaka," Miller said into the bullhorn, and the name sounded like an accusation. "His people own this store, but my grandfather told me about a time when this country was at war, a time of great peril. A time when we had to be careful about who we trusted. A time when loyalty was everything." He was talking about World War II, about the Japanese-American internment. He was activating a historical poison that was 80 years old. The crowd murmured. Some looked angry, some lot confused, but many were nodding. They were buying it. The alien signal had primed them, and Miller was giving them the script. "We can't have divided loyalties," Miller continued. "Not now. We need to be one people. For the safety of this town, the Tanaka family's assets will be held in trust for the community." They were stealing his store right there in the open, and they were calling it patriotism. Mr. Tanaka said nothing. He just stood there, a small, dignified man, as his life's work was stripped from him with a few well-chosen, historically loaded sentences. "This is how it starts," Jack said, his voice barely a whisper. "First the property, then the rights, then the lives. It's a checklist. The aliens found the checklist in our past, and Miller is ticking the boxes." Sarah pulled him away from the window. "They'll come for us next, Jack. The librarian with the lees, and the history teacher who complicates things. We are the intellectuals, we're the dissidents. We have to go." "Go where?" Jack asked, a wave of hopelessness washing over him. "The whole world is like this. Harmony Creek is just a little snow globe of the planet right now." "I don't know," Sarah said, her eyes frantic. "The woods. Somewhere we can hide. Somewhere we can think. We can't stay here. We can't watch this. We'll be next." He knew she was right. They had to run. They gathered what they could, a few bottles of water, the camping stove, a first aid kit. Jack grabbed a single book, a slim volume of poetry. He didn't know why. It just felt like something he needed to save. A small piece of humanity that had nothing to do with war or hatred. As they slipped out the back door of the library, they heard a new sound from the town square. It was the sound of the crowd. They were chanting a single, rhythmic word. Pure, 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 pure. The sound followed them as they ran, a death knell for the world they had known. They ran north, away from the town, plunging into the deep woods that surrounded Harmony Creek. The forest floor was a thick carpet of pine needles that muffled their footsteps. The air was cool and clean, a stark contrast to the thick atmosphere of paranoia they had left behind. For the first hour, they didn't speak. They just moved, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the chanting. Finally exhausted, they stopped in a small clearing by a gurgling stream. The sun filtered through the canopy of leaves, dappling the ground with light. It was peaceful. Deceptively so. "The woods are neutral," Sarah said, splashing cold water on her face. "They don't have a history, not a human one anyway." "That's not entirely true," Jack replied, ever the historian. "These woods were Wabanaki land before there were anything else. There were wars fought here. But I get what you mean. The trees don't remember." They sat in silence for a while. The only sounds the stream and the chirping of a few brave birds. The spell of the alien signal seemed weaker, out here, away from the feedback loop of the town. The raw, immediate fear was replaced by a deeper, more profound dread. "We can't just hide, Jack," Sarah said finally. "We'll starve, or they'll find us. Miller's not stupid. He'll organize search parties." "I know," Jack said. He was staring at the water, watching it flow over the smooth stones. "I keep thinking about what I said earlier, about division. The alien plan, the blueprint, it's all about division. Wetting us into the smallest, most hostile groups possible. Family against family, neighbor against neighbor, race against race." "So?" Sarah asked. So the opposite of division is unity, Jack said, looking at her. It sounds simple, cheesy even, but maybe that's the key, something they overlooked. What do you mean overlooked? Think like they do, Jack explained, leaning forward. You are a cold, logical alien intelligence. You scan our history for a weapon. What do you find? An overwhelming amount of data on conflict. War, murder, betrayal. It's the dominant theme. It's the most effective, repeatable pattern. But there are other patterns too, smaller ones, blips in the data, moments of unity, of cooperation, of sacrifice. He started to get excited. The historian in him finding a new thread to pull. The Christmas truce of 1914, when German and British soldiers stopped fighting to share songs and gifts. Doctors without borders, people risking their lives to help their supposed enemies. The way communities come together after a natural disaster. Strangers helping strangers. They're anomalies, Sarah said, catching on. To a logical mind analyzing data, they don't fit the primary pattern. They're statistical outliers. They're not an efficient tool for control or destruction. Exactly, Jack exclaimed. They wouldn't see unity as a weapon. They'd see it as a flaw in the system. A bug. They've given us a program based entirely on division. What if we could introduce a counter-program? What if we could do something that deliberately goes against their historical model? He stood up and started pacing again. We can't fight Miller's mob with force. We don't have weapons. We don't have the numbers. But what if we could disrupt the signal or confuse it? How? Sarah asked, her brow furrowed. How do you fight a psychic broadcast? By creating an event that doesn't compute, Jack said. An act of radical, illogical unity. We need to find other people. People who are scared, who are hiding. People who haven't completely succumbed to the signal. There have to be others. The Deputy Harris, he looked young. Maybe he's just caught up in it. Maybe some part of him knows it's wrong. Mrs. Gable, that hatred was deep, but it was also new. What's underneath it? He stopped and looked at Sarah. We can't just run. We have to go back, not to the town square. Somewhere we can gather the others who are lost, a sanctuary. Sarah's face was a mixture of fear and dawning hope. The old church, she whispered. The one on Hemlock Hill. It's been abandoned for 50 years. It was perfect. A church. A symbol of both historical division and potential sanctuary. It was isolated, defensible, and it was a place people might instinctively seek out when they were afraid. We make a stand there, Jack said, his voice firm. Not with guns, with an idea. We try to create a new pattern. We show them a part of the human blueprint they ignored. It was a wild, desperate plan. A poet and a librarian against an alien apocalypse. But for the first time since the White Flash, Jack felt a flicker of something other than fear. He felt a sliver of purpose. The aliens had read humanity's history. It was time to write a new chapter. Getting to the old church on Hemlock Hill was harder than they expected. The woods were no longer a neutral space. They could hear sounds now, the crack of a branch in the distance, a shout carried on the wind. Miller's people were out combing the forest. They weren't just a mob anymore. Jack and Sarah moved carefully, using the terrain for cover. As they neared the edge of the woods by the base of the hill, they saw something that made them freeze. It was Dave, the mechanic who had been painting a circle on his door. He was lying on the ground near a dirt road. He wasn't moving. From a distance, Jack could see the dark stain on his shirt. He tried to run, Sarah whispered, her hand covering her mouth. Jack felt a fresh wave of cold fury. Dave was a good man. He fixed Jack's car last winter, charged him half what he should have. What historical sin had he been accused of? Who knows? Maybe his great-grandfather was a union organizer. Maybe he had a cousin who fought for the wrong side in a war a century ago. Under the new rules, any pretext was enough. They gave Dave's body a wide berth, their hearts heavy, and began the climb up Hemlock Hill. The church came into view through the trees, a skeletal silhouette against the graying sky. It was a classic New England structure, white paint peeled away to reveal weathered gray wood, its steeple leaning slightly. The cross at its peak long gone. It looked forgotten by God and man, perfect for their purposes. The heavy oak doors were swollen shut, but the lock was rusted through. With a combined effort, they managed to force one of the doors open with a groan of protest. They slipped inside and closed it behind them, plunging themselves into dusty gloom. The interior of the church was cavernous. Light streamed in through grimy stained glass windows, painting the dust motes in kaleidoscopic colors. Pews were covered in white sheets, like rows of ghosts. The air was thick, with the smell of decay and old hymns. "We're here," Sarah said, her voice a small echo in the vast space. They weren't alone for long. As dusk fell, they came. One by one, in twos and threes. The first was a young couple, the Ortegas, who ran a small farm on the edge of town. Their family was from Mexico. They had been hiding in their own barn. Then came old Mr. Henderson, the retired science teacher, a man of logic and reason, who had been branded a heretic. Then, surprisingly, came Deputy Harris. He stumbled in, his red armband torn from his sleeve. His face was bruised, and his eyes were wild with fear and shame. "I couldn't," he stammered, leaning against a pew. "Miller, he told us to round up the undesirables. He gave us a list. Sarah, your name was on it. Jack, yours too. He said you were spreading dissent. He said you were a threat to the town's purity." Harris looked at the small group gathered in the church. "He told me to go after the Ortega family. I've known them my whole life. Maria Ortega used to babysit me. I couldn't do it. I told him no. They beat me. They called me a traitor." Here it was, the crack in the monolith, the human element the aliens hadn't counted on. Loyalty not to a historical tribe, but to a person, a memory, a kindness. By nightfall, there were 12 of them in the old church. A history teacher, a librarian, a farmer, a scientist, a disgraced cop, and a handful of other families who had been targeted for one phantom crime or another. They were a random assortment of humanity, a collection of statistical outliers. They built a small, smokeless fire in a metal bucket in the center of the nave, the flames casting flickering shadows on their frightened faces. "They'll come for us here," Mr. Ortega said, his arm wrapped around his wife. "They know people will run to the church." "Let them come," Jack said, his voice gaining a strength he didn't know he possessed. "We're not here to fight them. We're here to show them something else." But as the night deepened, the sounds from the town below grew louder. The chanting had started again, angrier this time, and then a new sound, a rhythmic hammering thud. It was the sound of axes against wood, the sound of doors being broken down. The purge had begun in earnest. The small flame in their bucket seemed a fragile, pathetic thing against the rising tide of hate. The blueprint for annihilation was being followed to the letter, and they were the last page. The mob arrived just before dawn. They came up the hill, not as a disorganized rabble, but as a disciplined unit. They carried torches, and the flickering light made their faces look like demonic masks. At the front was Bill Miller, his expression calm and determined. He looked like a man utterly convinced of his own righteousness. They surrounded the church. There was no shouting, no immediate violence. Just the intimidating presence of 50 men, armed with tools that had been turned into weapons. The small group inside the church watched them through the grimy windows, their hearts pounding in a collective rhythm of fear. "This is it," Deputy Harris said, his hand hovering over the empty holster on his belt. "He won't even try to talk. He'll just burn us out." "No," Jack said, his mind racing. "Burning the church is too generic. It's not specific enough for their model. This is a witch hunt, an inquisition. They want a trial. They want a confession." As if on cue, Miller's voice boomed from the bullhorn. "People of the church, you are harboring enemies of Harmony Creek. Traitors, dissenters, witches. Send them out and you will be spared. We only want to cleanse our town. We only want the guilty." It was the classic Inquisitor's gambit. Divide and conquer. Offer the flock salvation if they give up their shepherds. Inside, fear rippled through the small group. A woman started to cry softly. Her husband put a hand on Jack's arm. "Maybe we should give them who they want. You and the librarian. Maybe they'll let the rest of us go." Jack looked at the man's terrified face. The alien signal was still working, even here. The poison was in all of them, a whisper of self-preservation at any cost. "If we do that, we've already lost," Jack said, his voice low but firm. "If we sacrifice one of our own to save ourselves, we're no better than them. We're just following another one of their historical scripts. Betrayal. That's in the blueprint too." He turned to the group, his eyes pleading. "They want us to break. They want us to turn on each other. That's how their weapon works. The only way to fight it is to do the one thing they don't expect. The thing that doesn't fit their data. We have to stay together." Sarah stood up beside him. "He's right," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "They're operating on a script of hate. We have to write a new one. A script of solidarity." But words were just words. Outside, the mob was growing impatient. A rock smashed through one of the stained glass windows, shattering the image of a serene-looking saint. The spell of the sanctuary was broken. The violence was starting. "They're not going to wait forever," Harry said, peering through a crack in the door. "They're getting ready to storm the doors." Jack looked at the terrified faces around the fire. He looked at Sarah, her face smudged with dirt, but her eyes resolute. He looked at the shattered window, the outside world of hate pressing in. His plan to create an act of unity felt abstract and foolish, in the face of imminent brutal death. He thought about the blueprint. The aliens had analyzed all of human history. The wars, the genocides, the famines, the plagues, a relentless repeating pattern of destruction. They had concluded logically that this was humanity's essential nature, that the species was a failed experiment, programmed for self-destruction. Maybe they were right. Maybe trying to resist was like a single blood cell trying to cure a body riddled with cancer. Then a new thought, cold and sharp as the morning air, cut through his despair. The blueprint was a lie, or rather, it was incomplete. The aliens, in their cold logic, had made a fundamental error. They had mistaken the loudest, most violent parts of human history for the whole story. They had catalogued the symptoms, but they had missed the cure. And the cure was not some grand, heroic gesture. It was something much smaller, much quieter, and much more human. "The blueprint is flawed," Jack said. The realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. He turned away from the window and faced the small, terrified group. The aliens made a mistake. Mr. Henderson, the old science teacher, scoffed. A mistake? It looks like it's working perfectly to me, Keller. No, Jack insisted, his mind working furiously. They're logical. They analyze data. They looked for the most powerful, repeatable patterns. War, hatred, division. That's what they found. That's the blueprint they're using. But they missed something. They didn't understand it, so they discarded it as an anomaly. A rounding error. What did they miss? Sarah asked, her eyes fixed on his. Us, Jack said, gesturing to the group. Not us specifically, but what we represent. They missed the small things, the quiet things, the things that don't make it into the history books. They have data on the Holocaust. But do they have data on the German soldier who secretly gave a piece of bread to a Jewish prisoner? They have records of every battle in the Civil War. But do they have a record of a Confederate farmer giving water to a wounded Union soldier? They have the grand, bloody narrative. They don't have the footnotes. And the footnotes, that's where humanity actually lives. He started pacing in front of the altar, his voice filled with a desperate energy. Their whole plan is based on amplifying our worst historical impulses. But they don't have a file for simple, illogical kindness. They don't have a program for empathy. It doesn't fit their model of efficient self-destruction. To them, it's just noise in the data. So what are you saying? Harris asked, confused. We're going to defeat them with kindness. They have an army outside. Not defeat them, Jack corrected. Confuse them. Disrupt the program. We can't fight Miller's mob on their terms. We can't fight hate with hate. We have to do something that their blueprint has no protocol for. We have to introduce a variable they didn't account for. He looked around at the faces staring at him. He saw fear. But he also saw a flicker of understanding. He was offering them something other than a noble death. He was offering them a weapon they didn't know they had. Okay, Jack, Sarah said, stepping forward. What's the plan? What is this illogical act? Jack took a deep breath. The idea was terrifying. It was insane. It was quite possibly the last thing he would ever do. I am going to walk out there, he said. A collective gasp went through the room. They'll tear you apart, Mr. Ortega said. Maybe, Jack admitted. But I am not going out to fight. I am not going out to surrender. I am going out to talk to Bill Miller, not to reason with him. The signal is too strong for that. I am going to do something else. I am going to remind him of something. He looked at Sarah. Remember last year, after that big ice storm? My roof was damaged. A big pine branch fell on it. I had no idea how to fix it. Bill Miller came over. He didn't have to. He spent a whole Saturday on my roof with me, helping me patch it. He didn't ask for a dime. We drank a beer afterwards, right on my porch. Sarah's eyes widened as she understood. A memory, she whispered. A personal memory. Something that isn't in a history book. Something that has nothing to do with race or religion or politics. Exactly, Jack said. A moment of simple neighborly decency. It's a piece of data the alien scan would have ignored. It's irrelevant to their blueprint. It's just human. I'm going to walk out there unarmed, and I'm going to thank him for fixing my roof. I'm going to offer him a beer for when this is all over. It was the most absurd battle plan in the history of warfare. To counter an alien program of annihilation with the memory of a patched roof and a shared beer. It was an act of faith. Not in God, but in the small, stubborn core of human decency that the aliens had failed to catalogue. "While I am doing that," he said, turning to the rest of them, "I need you to do something too. Don't hide, don't cower. I need you to sing." "Sing?" Harris asked, bewildered. "Yes, a song, something simple, something everyone knows. Not a hymn, not a battle cry, something like, 'You are my sunshine,' a song about connection. A song that cuts across all the lines they've drawn between us. Sing it loud enough for them to hear. Let's see what their blueprint does when confronted with a memory of kindness and a children's song." He walked towards the great oak doors. This was it. The final, desperate stand. Not with fire and steel, but with a memory and a melody. He put his hand on the heavy iron latch, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He was terrified. But for the first time, he felt he understood the war he was fighting. Jack took one last look at Sarah. Her face was a portrait of terror and hope. She gave him a small, trembling nod. He turned and, with a deep breath that did little to calm his shaking hands, he unlatched the heavy door. It swung inward with a low groan. The grey light of dawn flooded the entryway. The mob outside fell silent. Every eye turned to him. He saw their faces twisted by the alien signal into masks of suspicion and hatred. He saw Bill Miller standing in the front, his face hard as granite, his hand gripping a heavy wrench. For a moment, all Jack could hear was his own blood roaring in his ears. The urge to run, to slam the door shut, was overwhelming. He forced his feet to move. One step, then another. He walked out onto the church steps, raising his empty hands to show he was unarmed. He was a history teacher, middle-aged and out of shape, facing down a programmed army. "Bill," he said. His voice was steadier than he expected. "It's Jack Keller." Miller's eyes narrowed. "Traitor. Get back in the church, we're coming in." "I just wanted to talk to you, Bill," Jack said, taking another slow step down. He was closing the distance. He had to be close enough for his words not to be a speech, but a conversation. "I was just thinking about that ice storm last year." A flicker of confusion crossed Miller's face. The word storm fit the narrative of chaos, but not the way Jack was using it. "The big pine in my yard," Jack continued, his voice calm and even. "A branch came down, punched a hole right through my roof. Remember that? I thought the whole ceiling was going to come down." He was 10 feet from Miller now. He could see the men behind him, gripping their weapons tighter, unsure what to make of this. This wasn't in their script. There was no protocol for reminiscing. "You came over," Jack said, a small smile on his face. "You didn't even hesitate. You climbed up there with me in the cold. Spent your whole Saturday helping me fix it. You never even let me pay you for the shingles." Miller's face was a war of emotions. The implanted, historical rage fought with a genuine, personal memory. Jack could almost see the gears of the alien program grinding, trying to process this irrelevant data. This small act of kindness didn't compute. It didn't fit the blueprint of division. It was an error message. We're neighbors," Miller stammered, the wrench in his hand seeming a little less like a weapon and a little more like a tool. "Yeah, Bill," Jack said softly. "We are." Then from behind him it began, a single hesitant voice at first. "Sarah, you are my sunshine, my only sunshine." Another voice joined in, the young Deputy Harris. "You make me happy when skies are gray." Then the Ortegas. Then Mr. Henderson. One by one, the 12 people in the church began to sing. Their voices were shaky, scared, and out of tune, but they were united. The simple, heartfelt melody floated out of the dark church and into the cold morning air. The effect on the mob was profound. The song was a part of a different history. The history of lullabies, of school concerts, of campfires. It was a history of shared, simple humanity. It bypassed the alien programming of hatred and tapped into something deeper, something the signal couldn't corrupt. Men looked at each other, their expressions of righteous fury softening into confusion. One man lowered the axe he was holding. Another dropped his tire iron with a clang that echoed in the sudden quiet. They looked at Jack standing there talking about a roof. They heard the song, a tune their own mothers might have sung to them. And the historical hatred, the amplified rage began to feel thin, artificial. It was a costume they were wearing, and they were suddenly aware of how foolish it looked. Bill Miller stared at Jack. The wrench fell from his hand, landing softly on the damp earth. His face seemed to crumble, the hard lines of the Inquisitor dissolving into the weary face of a hardware store owner from Maine. "Jack," he whispered, and his voice was his own again. "What's happening to us?" Jack didn't know if it was over. He didn't know if the alien signal was gone, or just temporarily confused. He didn't know what was happening in the rest of the world. All he knew was that here, on a small hill in Maine, a tiny, illogical act of humanity had just thrown a wrench into the blueprint for annihilation. He looked at the faces of the men before him, saw the dawning horror in their eyes as they began to remember who they were. He looked back at the church where the small chorus continued to sing their defiant, gentle song. The sun was rising, casting its first true rays over the hill. It was a new day, a new chapter, and for the first time in a long time the page was blank.